Hey everybody, welcome back to Sounds Like a Drum, Kane's independent media production. Today we are talking about the sounds of drums as it relates to sustain, the complete note, and exploring just how much of that we need to hear to be able to understand the sound that we're making. There's a lot that goes into the sound of a drum when we strike it. We have the fundamental, we have overtones, we have all sorts of different interactions going on between one or two heads at once. And how do we get to a place where we totally understand the sound of that drum? We've spent plenty of time in the past already on overtones, so we're going to set that aside today and look more at the complete sustain of the drum after you strike it as it starts to fade out. We're also going to do this in two different tunings today because to really explore this concept, we want to make sure we're adhering to a low range that a lot of us play in and also check out how it changes as we go significantly higher. Let's listen to these drums at the current low, pretty pedestrian tuning that we use here a lot. Today's going to be a little bit different in that we are going to be leaning entirely on the close mics on the drums today, and we're also going to be using a little bit of post-production, a little bit of mixing, and specifically gates on all of the drums to start to explore the sustain in these instruments. If gates are a new thing to you that you've never really gotten an opportunity to explore, you can think of it like an open door that the sound is passing through. The settings on the gate relate to how long the door is open, how fast you close the door, maybe how fast you open the door on the other end as well. What this means for us today is that we can start to shorten these drum sounds with a pretty aggressive gate in order to understand where in the sound we're hearing all of the parts of the drum. We've also, as you can see, done away with the ride cymbal today because we want to stay as staccato as we can with everything that we've got, apart from dialing in a fair amount of sustain into these drums so that we have something to gate. You can also think of using gates in this manner as a way to make things more staccato depending on the settings that you choose. When we say staccato here, what we're talking about is the separation between two notes. Short, 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 not overlapping at all. Let's move through single hits on the snare, the rack tom, and the bass drum, and go through a few different settings on the gate so we can hear that as we shorten and shorten and shorten these sounds, our perception of the character of the sound changes significantly. What you're hearing here is us changing one variable with the gate, and that is how long the door is open before we slam it shut really, really, really fast. With the snare drum, we have some wiggle room here because we are using a little bit of muffling on this. It is tuned very low, but in and of itself, it doesn't have a ton of sustain, so it's already giving us a little bit of a gated sound before we even start. Moving to the tom and the bass drum as well, the tom is pretty sustainy, the bass drum a little bit less so. So that means for us that we can make adjustments to each one of these in terms of the way they're being gated to make sure that we're getting the portion of the sound that we want and taking some things out of that microphone that we don't want in there. Now let's put this in the context of a groove. What you're going to hear is us moving through three different gate settings, starting with very, very short, slamming that door right away, so we're only getting the attack of each of the drums, and then increasingly longer periods of letting the sound through the door. Additionally, we want to remind you that this is only the close mics, because if we had the overheads in, there'd be a lot more things going on. It would confuse the process, so it's just these. So there are some extreme sounds in there, and there are also some sounds that don't sound that different than if we didn't have any gates on here at all. But the big takeaway here is that as the sounds get shorter and shorter, the information from the sound of the drum that's telling us how it sounds and how it makes us feel is getting lost. Not necessarily negative if you want that short sound, but it may influence muffling choices, it may influence miking choices, it may influence tuning choices as well. Listening back to some of the experiments that we're doing here today reminds me of the fact that I grew up with really gated drum sounds in the 80s, and I also didn't realize how gated a lot of drum machine sounds and electronic and synthetic drum sounds are just by virtue of how they're generated. So there's an ear towards some of these much shorter sounds, not so much because they're like the best sound, but because they give me like an emotional response to things I remember from when I was a kid, which I frankly wasn't expecting today. Next up, we're going to raise the tuning on everything and go through a similar process. What we discovered at this tuning is that chopping these higher notes off gave us a much more dramatic experience of them being cut off, because the presence of the fundamental in the note is so much faster at this higher tuning. It meant that experimenting with the gate gave us a really different experience of every part of this drum set, but at the same time it was inspirational in a similar way, because we were able to pull things in, take things out, and sculpt the sound of the drums without doing anything untoward to the drums other than the tuning. Now let's take these drums and put them in the context of a groove. Something interesting about higher tuned drums for me is that it tends to lend itself, for my playing at least, to being more dynamic, to playing a lot more subtle things on the drums because the response is so fast. Now, if you're going to do that with the idea in mind that there's going to be gating later, there's a high possibility that you're going to lose some of that low stuff. So if, for instance, you want to have a gated sounding funk groove with ghost notes, The ghost notes need to be louder a lot of the time than you would expect, because you're going to gate that drum, you're going to lose those quiet things in an effort to squish the loud one. I do want to mention at this juncture that what we're talking about here is a pretty gross oversimplification of the possibilities of utilizing gates on your drum tracks in post-production. You know, you could double tracks, you can have one that's blown out and hyper-gated and put it underneath a completely ungated one. There's a million possibilities there, but in terms of just the behavior of this particular situation, we are trying to go as extreme as we can to make sure that we can demonstrate these sounds. One of the really fascinating things about utilizing gates in this way, especially if you have the ability to do this in a practice scenario, even if it's just in GarageBand or something like that, is to get into how consistent you are with your playing in terms of volume and velocity and strike zone, all of that stuff. Because when you start to utilize a gate, it flattens everything out in a really specific way, where if some things are topsy-turvy and not quite all the same, you might lose a backbeat over here because it's not loud enough to get through, and then these other ones are going to seem super duper loud. So I guess it's fair to say that this is a really multifaceted way of understanding your sound, but there's also a version of it that's about your playing as well. A secondary thing that we want you to take away from this is realizing that sounds that are of this nature that you might be hearing in recordings and wondering why your drums don't sound so clean and separated as those recordings, it's things like this. It can be gating, it can be several levels of gating, frankly, and when you get home and you hit your rack tom and it lights the wires up on your snare and you wonder why your favorite record doesn't have a bunch of snare wire buzz on it, it could be purely post-production. It could have nothing to do with the sounds in the room. And what we're doing today is about as pure as it gets. We're just using gates on acoustic drums with close mics. So this is a window into just how extreme this can be, especially when you get into bigger budget recordings that we're used to hearing on the radio. Circling back to the door analogy earlier, there's a version of this that applies to when we try to do these kinds of effects to the drums physically with things like muffling. You can imagine trying to slow how the door shuts with a certain kind of muffling, or maybe it's Dutch doors and the high end is getting chopped off and you're slamming that really fast, but the low end part is moving a little bit slower and you're shutting the bottom half of the door a little bit slower. These things all exist in the context of records that we listen to, and the amount of these things that I've seen in studios and also had done to my tracks is astounding. What this means for us is remembering that the sound of the drums in front of us is one ingredient. The muffling that we might choose to use, or the heads that we choose to use, the tuning, these are all ingredients that are getting us to the finish line, but there's a lot that goes on after the sound leaves these, especially with recording, that we may not even be aware is happening, but is ultimately sculpting a sound that we are proud of, even though we only made the beginning part. In addition to things like EQ and gating and compression, like we haven't even touched on the idea of sample reinforcement or beat replacement with other sounds, which they're so good at doing now that if you just sit and listen to a record, it's nearly impossible to tell exactly what went into the drum sound that you're hearing in your headphones. And for us to sit down and even go so far as to meticulously tune and muffle and record everything at home to try to get a sound that we've heard on a record, unless we know every single last minute detail of what they did, all we can do is our best and get as close as we can and understand that any sound you hear, there's a lot of routes to getting there. And it doesn't matter exactly what they did or exactly what you're doing. As long as you're getting close to the sound you want, everything is fair game. Boy, we really hope that you enjoyed going on this journey with us. It's been really interesting seeing just what we could do at the source and then digitally later to kind of sculpt these sounds and get us closer to an idea that we had this morning when we came to work. If you enjoyed what you saw today, please follow the link below to the Patreon. It is the best way to support us, help us continue to do this here. We're two guys in a basement trying to do our best making videos, and we absolutely love this, so please check it out, see if there's a tier on there that's right for you, and of course, like, comment, subscribe, and please tell us any stories that you have about gating. Have you ever been gated before? Did you find out later that you were? Is this the first time you've ever heard of a gate at all? We'd love to know.